All right. Well, why don't we get started? It is 7 o'clock Eastern now. So welcome everyone to this webinar on ethical considerations in the use of artificial intelligence in head and neck surgical oncology. We're really looking forward to delivering this webinar and to some great conversation. Just by way of some ground rules, please, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to enter them in the Q&A. They'll appear either to us or to the entire group in the chat. So without further ado, let's get started. I'm Andres Burr. I'm a head and neck surgeon and associate professor at the University of Kansas. My co-moderator, Dr. Melina Winden, is an assistant professor at the University of Kentucky, also a head and neck surgeon. So we're going to get started. We're going to give a brief introduction, and then we have a number of different kind of individual presentations that will be given live. So for my portion of the presentation, these are my disclosures. I have no financial disclosures other than research support. So first off, what is artificial intelligence? So broadly speaking, artificial intelligence refers to computer systems that are able to perform tasks that normally require human intelligence. These include things like visual perception, speech recognition, complex decision-making, and even these days with tools like large language models, creative endeavors. To give a little bit more background, I want to provide a brief overview or a brief timeline of modern artificial intelligence. The modern era of artificial intelligence really began in the 1980s with the rise of machine learning. And to formally define machine learning, it's an approach that enables computers to perform specific tasks without explicit instructions, instead relying on patterns and inference. So if you think about a traditional computer program, the traditional computer program takes some data, it processes it in order to generate an output. Machine learning, on the other hand, starts with an output as well as the associated data. It then uses that to identify patterns within the data that are associated with the output in order to generate a program. So really the output is the program. That program can then be used to process new data in order to generate new predicted outputs. For those in the audience old enough to remember Clippy, this was an early version of the personal assistant that was quite unpopular, but it was based on machine learning. And so it was based on relatively primitive techniques that really made it not especially helpful. In the 2010s, in the 2010s, we entered the era of deep learning. And to understand deep learning, it's really based on the building block of deep learning is the artificial neural network, which is a computer algorithm that loosely mimics the human brain. It consists of various neurons that are interconnected. Data goes in one end and comes out the other in order to generate an output. And so this is a pretty simple example of a neural network here. This is a neural network that is designed to interpret handwritten digits. And in the top left, you see a handwritten number 7. Each individual pixel goes into the input layer of the neural network. It's processed and then generates the output of 7. So it correctly identifies that this is a number 7. And this technique, these neural networks form the basis for much more sophisticated algorithms, including computer vision algorithms like the one shown here, which is able to identify different traffic items or concerns, people in the street, vehicles, traffic lights, etc. And in the 2020s, we've really entered the era of generative AI. So generative AI really focuses on creating original content. So it identifies patterns within data and then uses that to generate something new. For those that haven't used the tool Midjourney, this is a tool that allows you to generate images from text prompts. So for example, if you typed in woman 1965 black and white movie still frame and nostalgia, you might get some images like the following. So really incredibly high quality images. These are all generated by AI. These are artificially generated. And so as you know, just really in the last 5 to 10 years, we've seen an explosion in the types of tools that are readily available for generating new content using generative AI. And generative AI isn't limited to just images. Of course, we can use generative AI for text, and there will be some talk about that today. ChatGPT is probably the best known tool that is a large language model that uses generative AI to create text. Image, there are various platforms, and increasingly we're seeing video creation platforms. Synthesia is an interesting company that can create a virtual avatar. So you can create your own virtual avatar, you can interact with it, you can have a conversation with it. So the technology is really growing rapidly. So how did we get here? This is really the result of the synergy of advances in computational power, the availability of large digital data sets, and this is particularly relevant in healthcare and in medicine, as well as algorithmic innovations that have really allowed for the current explosion in artificial intelligence, and the wide availability of new AI-based tools. Why does healthcare need AI? We all know that there's a tremendous amount of data being generated in healthcare. And if you look at the figure on the left at the center, between the year 2013 and 2020, so over that 7-year period, the data generated in healthcare, the total data generated in that year went from 153 to 2,314 exabytes. The amount of data that we're creating through healthcare delivery is really growing exponentially. So we need a way to process that. We need a way to leverage the power of that data in order to help make better decisions, in order to even be able to manage the sheer volume of data that's coming in. I want to give a few quick examples of applications of artificial intelligence in head and neck oncology, just to kind of prime the conversation around ethics and talk a little bit about what are some of the things that we are looking to do with AI in head and neck oncology. So before I launch into some specific examples, the focus of machine learning in particular is really around making predictions in order to make cancer care more personalized. So when you think about your own practice, what would be helpful to know before treating a patient that might impact the treatment that you recommend? So one example is the use of AI to predict occult lymph node metastasis for patients in early oral cancer. We all know that this is a very important factor, both for prognosis and for deciding the extent of treatment that patients should get. Should we do an elective neck dissection or should we not? And we know with current treatment paradigms, we perform a lot of elective neck dissections for patients without pathologic nodal disease. Historically, the depth of invasion of the primary tumor was used as a predictor of who is likely to have occult lymph node metastasis and which patients should be recommended to undergo elective neck dissection, with thresholds generally in the 3 to 4 millimeter range. So this is a project, or this is a study that we published in 2022, where we used a multi-institutional database of 634 patients. We trained machine learning models, and what you'll see on the figure on the right, this is a receiver operating characteristic curve. And this is a curve that essentially shows model performance. For those who aren't familiar, a line that approaches the top left corner is a very good predictor. A line that looks like the y equals x, the narrow dashed line is essentially a coin toss, or not a very good predictor. So in this instance, you can see we trained various machine learning models, which are the kind of multicolored solid lines. And these all outperformed a model that was based on depth of invasion alone, which had an area under this receiver operating characteristic curve of 0.62. So the takeaway from this particular study is that using available data, we can make better decisions about which patients with early oral cancer will benefit from elective neck dissection. Some other work that's ongoing is around trying to predict the presence of extranodal extension in oropharyngeal cancer using preoperative imaging. So you can imagine that this would be useful, because if we predicted extranodal extension, and if we could do so accurately, we could make more informed decisions about the best treatment approach for individual patients to try to avoid trimodality therapy. This is a study that really looked at whether human experts, so neuroradiologists with a lot of experience, whether they can look at a CT scan and make a prediction about whether there's extranodal extension or not on pathology. And what you can see from the data here is that really they could not. They had very poor predictive performance. There's very little correlation between two neuroradiologists, expert interpretation, and the presence of pathologic E&E. And this study was done at the University of Pittsburgh. This is work that I'm summarizing of Ben Kahn, who's a radiation oncologist, and this is these are some of the results where I'm not going to go into detail, but essentially what he did was he used images from CT of lymph nodes in order to try to predict pathologic extranodal extension. And unlike the human experts, the AI models, the deep learning, the deep neural networks, were able to accurately predict the presence of pathologic E&E. And again, you see this receiver operating characteristic curve with the various curves of different types of models that were used in this particular study. So the conclusion of this paper was that machine learning algorithms can be trained to identify nodal metastasis and E&E with excellent performance that surpasses what human clinicians have historically achieved. So this is really an example of where machine learning and artificial intelligence can go above and beyond what even human experts can achieve. And the last example that I'm going to review quickly is some work from our colleague, Dr. Chris Holsinger at Stanford. These are some images from a study that he did looking to use computer vision models in order to identify the recurrent laryngeal nerve during thyroidectomy. So you see the images above, and you see the masks of the actual nerves that were identified within these images by computer vision models. Now, this isn't ready for prime time, but really, this is an exciting and promising avenue for AI-focused research. And all of this is really kind of moving us in the direction of precision head and neck oncology. And I think that's a term that's thrown around a lot. But with the sheer amount of data that we have in healthcare and some of the tools that we now have using machine learning, artificial intelligence, and advanced statistics, the promise of precision head and neck oncology and truly, using patient-derived data in order to make meaningful predictions is closer than that. So with that, I'm going to turn the conversation over to Dr. Winden, who's going to talk a little bit about ethics.
Thank you, Dr. Burr, for that great introduction to AI and to AI and neck oncology. I wanted to take a minute to explain why the AHNS AI task force thought it was important to do a webinar on the question of ethics. First of all, AI is changing our practices and has direct implications for patient care. Commercially available diagnostic decision support tools powered by AI are being marketed for use in clinic. And this holds implications for our patients as well. A Google search today, in contrast to a few years ago, returns AI-generated results that look very much like truth to our patients. And as you mentioned, AI-supported path and radiology interpretation is being used to give reports that we use to diagnose and stage, just as some examples. Physicians have a heightened responsibility compared with the lay public for understanding the capability and limitations of AI. It's beyond just another IT upgrade. It's something that it's helpful for us to engage in. There are many AI developers who want to build tools that we can use in education, clinic, and the OR, but it's important that our own input and standards are part of the conversation just so we can build these tools to fit our context and standards. Next slide. I want to just briefly highlight a study that I'm sure many of you are familiar with that got a lot of press, published in JAMA Network Open last year. The study gave a group of physicians case vignettes, and then it looked at the diagnostic performance of those physicians compared to ChatGPT. And then it also allowed a group of physicians to use ChatGPT to solve the case, to solve the cases. ChatGPT outperformed the physicians significantly, and even when physicians were allowed to use ChatGPT, they tended to ignore it. This didn't include ENT cases, so a study in the White Journal last year specifically looked at the large language model's accuracy for head and neck cases specifically, and it's scored fairly well at about 81%. So while we can expect these models to get better and better, and as they do, what's the right way to use them to enhance rather than to replace medical expertise? And maybe more importantly, how can we convince our patients to continue to trust our expertise in the current landscape? Next slide. We have some amazing panelists with us tonight who may reference the principles of medical ethics. So just very briefly, these are beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, and justice. Beneficence is the ethical obligation to act in the best interest of the patient. Non-maleficence, of course, to do no harm. Autonomy emphasizes individuals' rights to make informed decisions about their own lives, and that includes consent. And then justice involves fairness in the distribution of the benefits. And for AI, this may mean ensuring equitable access, avoiding bias, and protecting vulnerable populations. Next slide. So with that, I want to introduce our panelists. As I do, Dr. Frankel, can you screen share and pull up your slides, please? First, we have Dr. Catherine Frankel, head and neck cancer surgeon and assistant professor of surgery at Wake Forest. She also serves as chief of the AHNS Ethics Service. Dr. Anais Ramu is unfortunately unable to join us live tonight due to an unforeseen circumstance, but she was kind enough to record her portion. She's a laryngologist and associate professor at Weill Cornell. Her role includes director of new technologies, and she's written broadly on AI in otolaryngology head and neck surgery. Lastly, we're joined by special guest Dr. Danton Char, a pediatric cardiac anesthesiologist, clinical researcher, and empirical bioethicist out of Stanford, who has been critically engaged on AI ethics and clinical care at Stanford and nationally. Thank you all so much for joining us. As Dr. Frankel starts off, I want to encourage those of you joining us again to put comments or questions in the chat, and Dr. Burr will be sharing those questions with our panelists live.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Do you mind just confirming that you can see the slides and everything's looking appropriate? Perfect. All right, well, so I am not the expert in artificial intelligence. Everybody who has just performed the introductions, I think, is far more expert than me, but I'd like to think that I have a good handle on surgical innovation and ethics. That tends to be my area of expertise, so that's what I'll talk about this evening. For disclosures, I could say that I don't have any relevant disclosures, but I would encourage everyone, since this is an ethics seminar, to think that's probably not correct. We are all very heavily biased, I think, in this. We have been putting data into an EHR model for a long time and not getting a lot in return. And this is finally the time where we can actually get some benefit out of all of the data we've been putting into the EHR. We all want patient-surgeon synergy. We all want efficient and more accurate assessments and better outcomes for our patients. So we as surgeons are all going to be major drivers of AI. There was a brief overview that was performed and very thorough of the head and neck cancer sphere AI. I have listed another reference on here, which was a systematic review for all of the current artificial intelligence uses for head and neck cancer management. It generally highlights 5 different areas: cancer detection, diagnostic aid, prognostication, pathology analysis, and treatment plans. But what I want to emphasize at this point is that currently artificial intelligence in head and neck surgery is primarily diagnostic. That's important to focus on. And then there are other fields in surgery which are evolving. This involves referral triage, surgical decision-making, as we've talked about already, surgical planning, intraoperative decision-making, and complication prediction, prognostication, and even surgeon performance monitoring. To my knowledge, things that are not really impacted by AI in its current state are surgical consent and operative procedural task execution. But it's really important to consider that, particularly in the latter form, that may change. So there's not a well-established published framework to consider how artificial intelligence will impact surgery. But this is derived from some of the literature that is published and has been tailored to head and neck surgery. I think it's important, as life is, someone will always have voiced an important idea better than you. So I just thought it was probably best to quote. Surgical innovation pits beneficence and non-maleficence against one another in the name of progress, creating tension between surgeons' most fundamental values. And so that's really the ethical tension that exists in artificial intelligence and its use in head and neck surgery. And so for all of these different phases of head and neck surgery, we're going to explore how this tension is created and how that can positively or negatively affect the patient. Phase 1 is diagnosis. The goal is accurate early cancer detection. Phase 2 is surgical consent. And the goal is for patients to truly have autonomy with adequate physician disclosure. Phase 3 is surgical planning and performance. Surgical innovation is necessary to optimize oncologic and operative outcomes. And phase 4 is prognostication with risk assessment for cancer recurrence. For phase 1 and 4, we can go through those quickly. The potential ethical concerns include non-maleficence, autonomy, justice, and professionalism. So beneficence is our core obligation as physicians, but we also have this core obligation that's complementary to do no harm. Everybody knows and understands the Hippocratic Oath, and it's very important as these AI models are emerging and not meticulously validated at this point to acknowledge that AI can result in overtreatment for some patients. It could result in unnecessary interventions, misdiagnosis, or other unintended causes of harm. Autonomy is very important in terms of physicians integrating AI, which is not at this point the current standard of care, as adjuncts into their surgical practice. Anything that is not the standard of care really ought to be disclosed to the patient, and it can be used to enhance decision making, but it also has to be disclosed with the goal of shared decision making in mind. The patient has to be aware that what the standard of care option would be and what the alternative might be with the modified suggestions from artificial intelligence. Justice is very important. I don't think we talk about it a lot. Do all patients have equitable patient access to evolving technology? Are the AI technologies fair and unbiased in their adoption, or are there other conflicts of interest usually that are promoting certain AI adoption, certain types of adoption technology over the other? Professionalism, I think this is probably considered one of like the soft points of ethical tension. And so I really want to emphasize we are at a point in medical education and our training where burnout is a significant problem. The amount of continued evolving reading and information is significant. And we have to acknowledge that surgeons do have a continuing medical education responsibility to self-educate and understand how to accurately interpret the results, even of innovative AI technologies. And the rapid pace of AI may create somewhat of a crisis in terms of being able for busy clinicians to keep up with the technology and truly understands the risks, benefits, drawbacks, and ethical tensions associated with these technologies. Phase 2, surgical consent. Again, AI is not changing surgical consent, but the surgeon has to change consent as they integrate artificial intelligence. Disclosure is one of the major issues associated with the use of AI or non-standard of care technologies. The reason is because incomplete disclosure can compromise patient autonomy. Patient autonomy means that the patient has to have the freedom to make their own decision. And if they don't understand that the influences on the standard of care and alternative off-label or innovative uses of technology that are offering something other than the standard of care, the patient ought to participate in that decision making and whether or not they too think that it's most appropriate to integrate the AI opinions per se sometimes into the decision-making process and the treatment process. process. This is particularly important when technology is involved that can directly influence the risks or procedures, any outcome associated with these. This is not just true for artificial intelligence, but for robotic surgery, for telesurgery, for all different types of new and cutting edge technologies that are being employed. And then conflicts of interest are extremely important when providing adequate informed consent. I think it's extremely challenging. I'll go through some conflict of interest breakdown points in a second, but there's a concept called therapeutic misconception. It generally applies to the patient. The patient misunderstands that the technology or research that's being used, they feel that their outcome will be directly benefited. But sometimes in information gathering, the benefit is not necessarily directly to the patient's outcome. It can be to future research. It could be to certain components of surgical involvement. And so conflicts of interest really ought to be thoughtfully considered and disclosed. Here are some outlines, a schematic of financial conflicts of interest. I think we always think of them as financial conflicts of interest. And we think of them as money and payment, but travel, grants, the things that can come from being leaders in artificial technology, those are also financial conflicts of interest that need to be surgeons themselves need to be aware that these are things that influence their decision making. And then there are non-financial conflicts of interest, and these are actually the things that ethicists and outsiders are going to attack surgeons most for in the media or critiques. These are recognition, awards, reputation, excitement. These are really the Achilles heel of surgeons when they try and innovate at a pace that is rapid as technology, ethics, and data are evolving in that sphere. The next sphere is the actual, not this, well, yes, the surgical performance, but also primarily the surgical planning. So this is the sphere of surgical innovation, and the ethics of surgical innovation is extremely challenging and highly contentious. So even therapeutic validated surgery can have the potential to become innovative, if not outright experimental. And so this is why the ethics of surgical innovation and what even constitutes an innovation, it's frequently debated. It's often an ethical gray area. And so the reality is that once surgeons have met institutional training criteria and credentialing requirements, they are entrusted to apply any technology. This is robotic surgery, this is artificial intelligence, ethically and with integrity in accordance with the standards of conduct set forth by the institution and the individual's professional societies. And that's why it's so important for us through the AHNS to become involved, because we are that professional society that sets the standard. The institutions are not going to set the standard in this case. Surgical innovation has many different forms. I think this is probably one of the best schematics that can really show that surgical innovation is a stepwise adjustment to everyday practice. Existing and well-established procedures are constantly adapted, and every surgical experience is to some degree unique. But when you consider that an innovation can result from a purpose change, a place change, a process change, a product change, or the person might be an innovative person and using things in a way that those other four areas haven't considered. Surgical innovation for research is defined and well delineated through the Declaration of Helsinki, the Belmont Report. These are classic ethical papers that define research conduct. That's what everyone does their city classes on. You have to remember this all the time. It's probably very boring. But clinical innovation, it's very exciting. And so it's very different. And the ethics that are involved in clinical innovation are quite different. And they're, as I've mentioned, very gray or not specific. The first clinical innovation that I'm going to talk about is validated off-label technology use. That means that there's an FDA-approved technology, but it's applied for an off-label indication, which could be AI that moves into a different sphere or a different purpose. And this usually occurs because there's robust clinical evidence to support this off-label tech use. And disclosure is really encouraged in these cases. Then there are unplanned experimental clinical innovations where surgeons follow a protocol, but improvisation is required. And often this is urgent, it's done on the fly. Informed consent isn't really obtained, it's implied for these patients because this is a necessary reaction from a surgeon's perspective to accommodate for the patient's best interests. There are clinical improvisations, which are validated surgery that include situation-specific innovation that is planned or non-emergent, and I'll talk more about that. The ethical concerns with clinical improvisation are multifaceted. One, the ethics involves self-regulation by surgeons, and that can be very hard or challenging depending on the conflicts of interest that are at play. This is very subjective, and disclosure can be very challenging because people, surgeons, we may be blind to our own conflicts of interest to some degree. Therapeutic misconception I talked about. Patients believe that decisions about their medical care, they're made for their benefit. They don't understand that a decision can be motivated by knowledge generation or scientific advancement. And cancer patients in particularly are extremely vulnerable and prime for exploitation in this arena. And then clinical equipoise in clinical improvisation is important. So what this means is constantly evolving, but surgical investigators have a threshold of proportionality. And what that means is, as an individual surgeon, do you feel that the benefits of AI are outweighed by the risks? And once you make, and that AI crosses that threshold of proportionality, and that AI offers something that's an alternative to the standard of care, then what it means is that there's a breach of clinical equipoise. So now the surgeon does not know what the right thing is to do. They have two options that should be in the best interest of the patient. And so this component of clinical equipoise, it's constantly evolving, it's constantly influencing clinical improvisation, but it's an important concept to understand as we as individual surgeons self-regulate. So that's my introduction, hopefully just a primer, and that is my dog, because I don't have children and I get to put pictures of my family on there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Frankel. I see some hands up. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat, the Q&A, and we'd be happy to ask them for you. Again, if you ask directly to the host and panelists, so we're happy to ask them anonymously for you. And as we do this, I'm going to bring up Dr. Rameau's video. She pre-recorded her talk because, again, she wasn't able to join live. The first question is from Dr. Weir. Would be grateful for insight on handling IRBs. My board is very leery of AI, and it has been challenging to provide reassurance to them that HIPAA risk would be minimal with standard de-identified data.
I think that's
Catherine, do you have any thoughts?
I think that's a good question. I think it's the subject that I covered least, which is research, clinical ethics of surgical innovation. I think in this case, regulatory agents have to be conservative, and the burden is on the physician to demonstrate that you are protecting patient data, and you have to demonstrate how you're doing that. And so de-identified data sets generally are not a HIPAA violation. So I'm not sure specifically why that would be if it's truly a de-identified data set. For example, that's like NCDB data, SEER data, things that sometimes you don't even, I mean, usually it's expedited IRB approval for these things and really not questioned or challenged. But I'm sure that there are probably mentors in the audience as well that can facilitate or work through whatever problems you're experiencing.
Yeah, I would add, having done a handful of AI related projects, as long as we use de-identified data, our IRB is generally okay with it. And you know, any identified data is stored in a HIPAA compliant fashion and not used to generate AI models or distribute it in any way. But you know, I'm happy to chat with you offline to help you troubleshoot some of the struggles. We have a question. We have experienced ethical concerns with journal reviews being done with AI. Now, many letters of recommendation being done with ChatGPT, different era for sure. Definitely an important topic and very timely. So I'm going to, in the interest of time, I'm going to play Dr. Rameau's pre-recorded talk where she's going to focus on some of these ethical challenges around the use of AI, particularly when it comes to both journal reviews and manuscript generation.
Hi, everybody. My name is Anaïs Rameau. I am a laryngologist at Weill Cornell, and I'm very sorry not to be able to join you live tonight. I had a family situation that did not allow me to join the live discussion. Tonight, I will be presenting on should we be using generative AI in the production and dissemination of research and innovation in otolaryngology, head and neck surgery. These are my disclosures, and I will try to stay on time. Here I'm going to be presenting a fictitious case that we had been using as a way to articulate arguments in favor and against the use of generative AI in research and innovation in otolaryngology in an ethics in practice paper in the White Journal. And as a reminder, that's actually a really great way to publish in ethics and otolaryngology. So remember that there is that opportunity through the White Journal. We've had a number of publications, and it's a really great format because it really forces you to think about the arguments and the counter arguments. With that, the fictitious case that we had used in this specific paper was that of a team of researchers who are laryngologists and are interested in seeing whether they can decrease the unnecessary visits to the laryngology office in patients with subglottic stenosis. And in order to do their data collection, they decide to use an AI chatbot that communicates with the patients through their phones and asks them questions about their symptoms and also collects questions related to patient reported outcome measures. And the endpoints of the research are the number of unnecessary visits to the laryngology office and also the number of surgeries per year. And because the number of patients with subglottic stenosis is fairly small, this team of researchers also decides to use generative adversarial networks to create some synthetic data to augment their data set and to help with achieving significance. And what they notice with their paper is that they are able, with their research, is that they're actually able to reduce the number of unnecessary visits, and the frequency of surgical interventions is overall diminished in the cohort of patients that was communicating with the chatbot. Because this team of researchers is also not great at producing manuscripts, they decide to use generative AI to help with the background information for the introduction and the discussion of the paper, and help them also with the analysis of the data. So next, I'll be first presenting the arguments against the use of generative AI in OHNS research. And here are the arguments. The first one is that it's a little bit of an abstract one, but The way generative AI works is that it predicts the next best word in a sentence, taking into account the context of the sentence. However, it doesn't really have a full human understanding of the practical aspects or the practical context of the sentence. And so in terms of linguistics, we could say that generative AI is very good at being sound from a semantic standpoint, but not from a pragmatic standpoint, because it lacks that practical knowledge about what it is like to be a laryngologist or a patient with subglottic stenosis. In addition, there are other issues that are well known, and that's the issue with hallucination and confabulation, and the fact that, for instance, in the manuscript production, the generative AI could be producing false information, background information that then ends up being published into the paper because it looks and sounds true. Another argument against the use of generative AI is that the same prompt can actually lead to very different results. People have noticed, for instance, that the same prompt being used at different time of the day could lead to very different outputs. And so it's really important when you do this type of research, actually, that you test out your prompts, your prompting strategy, and that you do it many, many times in to see basically whether there's consistency in the output of the model. Another limitation with large language model use in research is that when you prompt generative AI, oftentimes your question is biased, and there's a framing effect in that you want generative AI to come up with a certain answer, and the way you ask your question will tend to generate the type of answer that will be pleasing to you as a user. Another concern with generative AI, and especially in the production of synthetic data, is that the synthetic data that's produced could be false and could actually be biased and might falsely lead to statistical significance and eventually be harmful by producing false results in the literature. Other arguments against the use of generative AI in researching otolaryngology include the issue related to the AI content loop. So we just recently published a paper actually with in Laryngoscope looking at the increasing number of or the increasing incidence of generative AI use in manuscript production in otolaryngology. Now, think about 5 years from now when this practice becomes extremely common and most papers in otolaryngology are actually partly or completely AI generated. Then we get to a situation where AI learns from itself, and most of the training data for AI is also AI generated. They can lead to what is called an AI content loop. And we don't exactly know what that means. We don't really know if this is going to lead to a fairly biased AI or AI that is completely distorted in its output and doesn't really reflect our reality. But there are certainly concerns about AI learning from itself. There are also concerns about plagiarism, as we are not really sure when generative AI produces an output, we don't really know where it got its information from. We might not cite all the papers that basically fuel the output of the large language model. There are some commercial options right now, or such as open evidence that will provide some of the citations, but still we don't have full transparency on what trained the AI. Another concern is related to patient privacy and the fact that you can't really share your patient data with large language models because there are currently concerns about the practices of these large tech companies. And for instance, at our institution, the only way we can use large language model on our patient data is by using local models that are on our computers, and that restricts us to a fairly small number of existing large language models. And then finally, another last point against the use of generative AI in manuscript production in OHNS is the risk of deepfakes and the fact that you can generate medical images that actually do not reflect the result of your study. So for instance, for Western blots, we can get very realistic Western blot that actually are false, and that can be supporting misleading scientific claims. So now let's talk about the more positive side of generative AI and manuscript production in OHNS. With the use of generative AI, we can improve research efficiency and save time on monotonous tasks that do not require creativity and ingenuity. So for instance, data collection in this case can be quite demanding. For instance, calling patients and being able to find them at the right time to be able to see how they're doing at home versus using an AI chatbot can really relieve a research team. There is also the fact that generative AI can expose us to new ideas because we in otolaryngology and head and neck surgery tend to be focused on our field and are not always exposed to ideas from other fields. And a large language model can give us an opportunity to really learn from other fields by providing us that information that we otherwise would not be exposed to. And then you can actually use large language models to manage a research project and creating workflows that are efficient. So that's something that's currently done a lot in industry and business. And then final sets of ideas in favor of generative AI in OHNS for scientific production. So it really lowers the barriers to scientific writing, and especially for our colleagues who are not English speakers. This can really allow them to contribute meaningfully to the scientific literature, whereas before they might be rejected because the language was just not on par with the standard of a journal. Synthetic data can also be extremely useful in the case of rare diseases, and when the data is scarce, that has been found to be the case in other types of in other parts of medicine. And here I have actually images from a paper from Matt Crossan, who's an otologist, and where synthetic images of the tympanic membrane were created and were found to basically not be distinguishable from realistic images, real images of the tympanic membrane, and then were used to train a machine learning algorithm and improved the performance of the machine learning algorithm in differentiating a normal tympanic membrane from an abnormal tympanic membrane. And then lastly, the last point is that synthetic data can actually improve, and that's actually what I just covered. So thank you so much. I will finish by providing you my email address. And again, I'm very sorry I couldn't be with you tonight, but I hope you have a productive and interesting conversation tonight with my lovely colleagues. Bye-bye.
Why don't we skip ahead to Dr. Char's presentation? Danton, are you able to share your slides?
Yeah, happily. Thank you for including me. I am not a head and neck surgeon. I'm a pediatric cardiac anesthesiologist with my day job, but I'm part of the oversight of all the AI being rolled out across Stanford Healthcare. So you guys have asked me to come speak. I have to say, in this climate, a very valid question is, what is the value of AI governance right now? And I think that'll overhang this presentation, and we can talk about it in the end. So I want to talk about the ethical evaluation process we're developing at Stanford Healthcare. I want to identify some of the ethical issues that are actually arising from implementations of healthcare AI tools into clinical workflows that we're seeing, and evaluate some of the ethical issues and their impacts on current and future AI implementations. And hopefully this will have some resonance for your work in head and neck surgery. I'm part of a larger evaluation process that we're calling FIRM, the Fair, Useful, Reliable Models, that includes an ethics evaluation process, but also an economic impact and evaluation of the model, and increasingly an examination of the impact on workflows. And that multidisciplinary evaluation is how we're approaching the idea of seeing if AI if AI works or doesn't. I'm sorry about that hop there. So the process, and this is from Nigam Shah, my close collaborator, our first stage is to examine the what and the why of rolling out an AI tool. What's the problem? What's the need that's being addressed? What's the use case? What are some usefulness estimates by workflow simulation? What are the financial projections? And what are the potential ethical considerations or implications? The how stage, how do we reuse or learn a new model for the context? How do we train the model to get the best fit? How do we deploy it across Stanford Healthcare infrastructure? And how do we get the model output appropriately back into clinical workflow? And then the impact stage is evaluating, monitoring, and prospective evaluation. So this is a little bit of a complex slide, but I just want to give you the higher level thinking behind our ethics evaluation process. So the leftmost slide is any design implementation process I took from Stanford Design, but this is anything from the conception of an idea through its development and implementation, right? At any stage along that process, there are questions that need to be answered. What's the goal of the tool? Where do you set test characteristics like sensitivity and specificity that have latent in them values considerations? Where different stakeholders impacted or potentially impacted by an AI tool, how they would answer these questions, where they collide on their answers are where we think ethical problems are most likely to emerge. None of us can predict the future, but those fault lines of value collisions seem to be where we have trouble downstream. So what are we doing? Well, as my colleague Dr. Frankel just spoke, there have been a number of principles put forward, important and salient principles to guide AI implementation. One of the challenges we're all facing as institutions is how do we come up with a process by which we can evaluate tools in light of the principles we've agreed upon as being useful for AI tools. One of the issues we've discovered is it's really workflow more than models. There are ethical problems inherent to models. Bias leaps to mind. But the workflows into which tools are deposited also have considerable ethical considerations. And I'll come to that with the two case studies I want to talk about quickly. Fair is not a synonym for ethical. Bias is important, but it's not the only ethical issue that we're seeing coming up by any stretch. To illuminate blind spots, we're trying to triangulate stakeholders' views of all of the impacted stakeholders and what they're thinking about an AI tool, as well as the design decisions they would want made. The values collisions are important. There are multiple ways to resolve ethical concerns. We can draw on prior ethical scholarship. Sometimes there are novel issues emerging with AI tools that we have to come up with new solutions for. Okay, we've gotten some funding in my disclosure here, both from foundations as well as from PCORI, to expand this process that we're developing, to make it scalable across multiple institutions. A big challenge facing America right now is going to be how are lower resource, not big academic medical centers, but lower resource centers going to evaluate their AI, and what governance support will they need, perhaps from better funded academic centers to help them in their guidance, if at all. This is our team, my close collaborator, Michelle Mello, myself, as well as a multidisciplinary team of research scientists and postdocs working on all this. So this is our current process. For every tool that's deployed, the leftmost column, we conduct an intake. We review all the documentation for the tool. We hear proposers' presentation about how the tool works, what the problem intended to solve is, and from that, we come up with a series of just initial ethical issues. We then interview all of the prospectively impacted stakeholders we can identify. That's roughly about 4 of the clinician users, 3 members of the design team, and 4 members of the patient partner panel. As I'll talk about in my first use case, we have to strike a balance between comprehensive interviewing of all stakeholders, but also doing this in a timely fashion so that it's usable to people. One of the biggest challenges we ran into was with patients. When we were doing our initial work, we just got a lot of echo chambers because AI literacy is so low right now that when we presented a tool to ask patients their views about it, they really just parroted back what we had told them about the AI tool. So like clinical ethics committees bring in members from the community but train them up, we've partnered with a group of patients, as we've made the group as diverse as we can in types of illness, whether they're family members, whether they've cared for children who have been ill, whether they themselves have had transplants, to all train up with us for the next 3 years and be part of the oversight of AI tools. And so in so doing, learn through the case studies. We also, to try and better identify areas we miss, have created an expert oversight panel, which is multidisciplinary of people who are data scientists, people who have expertise in AI governance and just governance of medical centers generally, as well as ethicists, to try and call out issues that we don't identify in our interviews. And then as a final process, we come up with a final report, which we send to the full patient partner panel, as well as to the proposer team. We're striking a balance here. We're not an IRB, and this isn't to take a shot at IRBs at all, but IRBs are really designed to evaluate regulatory compliance. In the absence of regulations for AI, it's not clear how useful they are for addressing potential ethical issues with AI tools. We're trying to create a coaching culture to be helpful and not obstructive of people who are innovating AI tools. We don't have the naysay power. Our report and our recommendations and our evaluation goes to an executive committee comprised of the C-suite as well as multiple department chairs and the dean's office, who then make the decision about which tools move forward or don't move forward. Okay, so briefly in the time I have, I want to do 2 case studies. This is the very first tool we evaluated. This is a mortality prediction tool, machine learning guided mortality prediction tool to guide advanced care planning. So most Americans would love to die at home. Most Americans succeed in dying in the hospital. This tool was rolled out to try and identify the projected 1-year mortality risk for all patients being admitted to the inpatient adult medicine services as a way of targeting patients who could benefit from an advanced care planning conversation, ideally flagging the patients for the palliative care service to come and approach them. This is what Natalie Deutsch, who is now at NHGRI, but was then our amazing research assistant working on this, calls our Netflix serial killer diagram. But this is us trying to identify all the potential stakeholders impacted. And the point I want to make is it was really the closest concentric circles that were of high yield for the interviews. The further out we got from either the design team or the clinical context, we had saturation. People really didn't have any additional insight. The only caveat to that is people who were in a position of governance over the hospital or the AI tools provided relevant guidance that we couldn't get from the bedside clinicians or the proposers, which is to say people who had an understanding of the overall goals of the institutions. And then the challenges I already articulated about patient interviews, which is why we led to the patient partner panel that we've done. This is a values collision. I just want to call it out. They're not subtle. So this is one of the designers talking about meeting with hospital administrators. At one point, they were asking me, can you guys predict if patients have got 24 hours or less? Because if they've got 24 hours or less, we're going to put them in observation and not admit them. And observation means they're not officially admitted. And if they die in observations, they don't count as a death. And I was like, I feel like I'm going to vomit in my mouth right now because you're telling me you want to know that they're going to die in 24 hours because you wouldn't put them in a normal inpatient acute care bed. You'd put them in observation. That's a values collision. So we identified several that were of utility to the design team. The first is stemming from this. Who gets the mortality prediction, right? Does it go to the patient? Does it go to the bedside clinician? Does it just go to the palliative care clinician? As a corollary to that, are there unintended uses other than for advanced care planning, right? If it goes to the oncologist and the oncologist says, I was thinking about doing this very aggressive chemotherapy, but because they're projected to die in the next 6 months, I don't think we're going to do that. Is that an appropriate use of this mortality prediction? And then the third and most unwieldy was, what do you do when the prediction may be correct, but a referral to advanced care planning is wholly inappropriate, like someone who's at high risk of non-accidental trauma or a drug overdose? All of these suggestions led to the team reframing their workflow plan. They stopped calling it a mortality prediction. It only goes to the palliative care team as a screening tool for them to then approach the bedside clinician, ask and verify if the patient's appropriate. That still cuts down on the workflow labor because until that point, palliative care was having to manually screen every patient who was being admitted, and they were missing huge amounts of patients. This is much more efficient, but it takes off this burden of putting forward a mortality prediction into the clinical care context and disrupting the workflow. Okay. Second case study, I want to be mindful of time quickly. We were able to partner with the first NIH-funded fully autonomous AI trial. So this is the lower left corner or the lower right corner. This is Michael Abramoff's work. He got funded, approved by FDA in 2018 for this autonomous device. And I'm going to do my bird goggles here. It's a point of care device that you just look in and it screens for diabetic retinopathy. So Risa Wolf, who's the first author on this paper that I'm highlighting here at Hopkins, she's a pediatric endocrinologist. This is one of the big COVID grants to look at whether they could use this tool for economically disadvantaged and minoritized patients who were marginalized from healthcare in the Baltimore urban areas, to use this tool as a screening tool. And we were able to partner with that study to see whether we could apply principles to our evaluation. So NIH, this is Chris Grady and Zeke Emanuel's work, have a series of 7 principles that guide ethical trials of any type. That it have social and clinical value, that it be scientifically valid, that you fairly select the subjects for the trial, that there's a reasonable risk-benefit ratio, that you have independent review, that you have informed consent, which we'll touch on, and that you have respect for the potential and enrolled subjects. What did we find? Well, we found asking people about principles wasn't that useful. They did much better as answering concrete questions about development. You do much better about saying, who are you going to include and exclude, as opposed to asking them about general questions of fair subject selection. But we also provoked a series of ethical challenges that are not easily addressed. Using AI to expand access. Is it okay to have a different type of care? Right? This tool is designed to function independently and be usable at point of care. But using this tool to expand screening is a tension between reducing an access inequity, but doing so with biased training data. Because by definition, if you're using it to access a patient population that has been marginalized from healthcare, they're not going to be reflected in the training data that you have. Is that okay? Is it okay to have a different type of care than that which is received by not so vulnerable patients, right? And presents a novel labor care delivery model. If I have a retinal problem and I'm in the Baltimore area, I'm going to get seen by one of the ophthalmologists at Hopkins. I'm not going to go to a point of care AI tool. Is that all right? Related to that is this question of cost. We've been talking a lot about, there are many reasons that AI is being implemented into care. Chief is that it reduces expensive labor. So to take cost out of the equation is to be a little disingenuous. But we've struggled to demonstrate outcomes that are necessarily better with AI tools. People have talked about non-inferiority studies with AI tools. So then a question begins to emerge, well, if it's a little inferior, but you can demonstrate a significant cost benefit, what is the cost benefit relative to the inferiority to whatever gold standard you're comparing it to that you find appropriate? And that presents a number of challenges because calibrating better performance for a screening AI tool is more expensive. There are societal benefits to reducing the burden of disease, but those are very rarely realized by the healthcare system that's paying for the development of the AI, or honestly any novel technology. So how much can or should a healthcare system spend on screening, particularly in populations that are going to have limited reimbursement for their services? And conversely, what cost savings justify what inferiority in outcomes or performance relative to your gold standard? And related to that is the problem that my field had in the 90s when all these eager young fellows were running out to sub-Saharan Africa with portable ultrasounds to identify cardiac lesions in children, and then realized there were no surgeons on the continent who could operate on the kids. If you can identify the lesions, if you still have an access disparity, is it appropriate to do the diagnostic testing if you can't ensure that there's therapy to treat the disease once identified? Okay, and then barriers to informed consent. I know Dr. Frankel talked on that, so I won't harp on it too much. Is informed consent in fact needed? Or is it like any other algorithm that we use in healthcare? I don't know why my slides are hopping. I apologize. But it makes the most sense to randomize an AI tool at the clinic level. How do individuals opt out? Right? If you are a minoritized, socioeconomically disadvantaged patient and you only have the one clinic you go to and that has been randomized to AI, how do you not have AI in your care? Other challenges with informed consent are exactly what we've encountered in listing patients in our interview studies. How do you explain the technical aspects for informed decisions? Honestly, frankly, it's a challenge with clinicians too. I think most of us have limited or nascent understanding of artificial intelligence. And how do we make transparent all the privacy and confidentiality considerations when patient data is being used for ongoing development? as a corollary, this is a smaller issue, but downstream, probably single disease screening isn't going to work out so well. There was a lot of confusion around understanding that a patient had only been screened for diabetic retinopathy and not screened for multiple eye diseases, and that was at the clinician level as well. So I think that from a cost and workflow standpoint, it's going to make sense to have multiple disease screening if we do it, as opposed to multiple single disease screenings. Okay. How am I doing for time? So some of the big issues, just to touch on quickly, that I didn't talk about that we're seeing recurring more and more, effects on labor. This has come up a lot with the large language models, particularly in our studies of like nursing note summarization tools. It turns out that if you're going to save labor's time, labor cares a great deal about how those savings are reallotted, right? And particularly if concerned about having to do, say, 10% more work or see another 5 patients per day in clinic if an AI tool is generating their notes for them, and that saves an hour of their time. Model proliferation and crowding we're starting to see. I'm sorry about the hops. That's alarm fatigue writ large. We're seeing it already. Many clinicians are starting to say to it, that's wonderful that you can screen the patient by an ECG for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, but my patient has 10 other problems and they're not getting their diabetes treated, and we need to stay on top of that. Okay, I think we talked about the other ones. So questions as we move forward. What outcomes should we be tracking? How do we actually demonstrate that the ethical evaluation of tools has value? I don't know the answer to that question. We're still figuring that out. What can lower resource health systems handle in terms of AI governance? Absent regulatory requirements, why should health systems be persuaded to invest in AI governance? And what's the best way to engage patients? All right. Thank you very much for including me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Char. You really brought up some really critical points. I think that you were able to kind of model how this is done in an ideal world. I don't think all of us at the other institution will necessarily have access to the same, but at least it's helpful for us to see kind of how it's done in an ideal setting. I want to thank Dr. Frankel as well for bringing up some really critical points. You know, not all of us think about ethics every day, and it's really important to be able to kind of hear about your thoughts on that and to hear it discussed to help us understand how to kind of move forward and think about some of these things. With that, I think that Dr. Burr may be pulling up a slide with upcoming events on AI within AHNS. But I want to highlight some of those. We recorded a lively podcast with Dr. Eric Gantworker recently, coming soon on the Young Members Corner homepage. And don't miss our panel on precision surgery and the Hayes Martin lecture, of course, at COSM as well. And I'll see many of you, there it is, and I'll see many of you in New Orleans. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. And I guess we have, yeah, I think we'll close out with that. Thank you all so much. Thank you for our panelists.